Hey, okay, welcome back to the second division of being in time now. So we'll be looking at division 2, which is called Dasein and Temporality. And the first chapter is the possible being a whole of Dasein and being toward death. So basically, Heidegger starts here by revisiting the hermeneutical situation, which you remember is that idea of interpretation based on that force structure, and notes that it is still incomplete. And so that's what we're doing. We're still just rounding out, completing what we started in Division 1. So we had the foresight. Remember, foresight is kind of the refers to the individual thing. So this has our foresight thus far has defined existence as a potentiality of being, which is always mine and is always free for authenticity or inauthenticity. So far in the first division, we only examined the inauthentic mode of being, which is that being in the they. Now we have to investigate authentic potentiality of being. The for having, which is kind of like the background context. For having must bring the whole of Dasein, therefore, from beginning to end into view. But so far, we've only investigated everydayness, which is the being between birth and death. Further, if Dasein is always a potentiality of being, then by definition there's always going to be something outstanding from our understanding. So the way we've described Dasein is always being for something, being towards the future. And if that is a central part of our being, then something's always going to be kind of incomplete in our understanding. And to that end, we need to include death in our interpretation of for-having. Our final foreconception, therefore, which is basically the definite and final conceptualization, will include, therefore, Dasein's authentic potentiality for being whole. And this will give us what Heidegger calls phenomenal primordialness. And that's kind of that's what we're going to be looking at in the next two chapters. And then from chapter 3 onwards to the end, we will go back and revisit each of these ontological structures and free them with regard to their temporal meaning. So we'll get into how time fits into Heidegger's philosophy there. Okay, so let's hit chapter 1 first. We've looked at the structural factor of care, which is being ahead of itself. And this means there's always something outstanding in Dasein, which I mentioned just before. So this is a big problem with regard to Heidegger's goal of reaching an understanding of the whole of Dasein, our being in total. And it suggests that this existential project may in fact be unfulfillable in its essence. There's always going to be something, this incompleteness, there's always going to be something missing. And so what it suggests is that Dasein only reaches its wholeness in death, when all potentialities for being are extinguished. So all those potentials become null, if you like, at death, and it's kind of there that Dasein is complete and finished, if you like. The problem with that is that at that same time, at death, Dasein simultaneously loses the being of the there, and all possibility of experiencing is also denied to it. So we've kind of got this catch-22, and it looks on the face of it like it could be a game stopper, if you like. To solve it, we need to include death in our understanding, because it's at that point where all potentialities finish, so we can arrive at some kind of complete understanding. But at that point, we lose all possibility of experience. So is there, is this an unrealizable goal that Heidegger's set for himself, and to understand the entirety, the whole being of Dasein, Dasein's being as a whole? So we'll need to look at death, and that's where we're going with this. So first of all, Heidegger looks at the possibility of experiencing the death of others. So we encounter the deceased phenomenally, not as a lifeless thing, but as something unliving which has lost its life, and as something which we continue to take care of in funeral rites, burial, mourning, commemorating, etc. So this relation isn't one with something objectively present, nor is it one with something at hand. So in this kind of being with the dead, the real having come to an end of the deceased is precisely not experienced. So even though we can kind of understand death, if you like, through the death of others, it doesn't actually allow us to fully grasp death itself. But it tells us two things. The first is that it cannot be experienced through another. Death can't be experienced through another. So no one can take the other's dying away from him, is how Heidegger puts it. Only you can die your death, if you like. And it's interesting because that is the opposite to the everyday mode of being, where everything is anonymous, where everybody is replaceable, right? And so that's interesting. There's already kind of that distinction opening up here, where that everyday life, everyday being is, we can see its inauthenticity, as opposed to the authenticity of facing death. The second thing it reveals is that the going out of the world of Dasein is fundamentally not like the going out of the world of something merely living. Because when Dasein dies, it is a no longer being there. It's that no longer... Dasein was never in the world in the way that things objectively present are. So when it leaves the world, its leaving it has a different quality to it. So then, is death a lack of wholeness, as in something outstanding? For example, a debt owed? Well, we said it's outstanding, but Heidegger's just investigating some different options, ways we can understand it. And the first thing he raises is it outstanding in the way that a debt is outstanding? But outstanding here means that what belongs together is not yet together. And this kind of being is the kind of being of something at hand, kind of being of something objectively present. So Dasein is not that kind of being that is only together when it's not yet has been filled out. Rather, Dasein always already exists in such a way that it's not yet belongs to it. So it's not outstanding in that sense. Outstanding meaning that what belongs together is not yet together. So there's something incomplete, something waiting to kind of round it off. But that's what something at hand, the kind of being of something at hand, waiting for something to finish it. And Dasein is not that kind of being. Dasein's not yet. Its future, its potentialities, always belong to it. Always, from the beginning. There is no... Dasein isn't incomplete in that sense, that it's waiting for something, or there's something coming to it to be added to it which can complete it. Dasein's not like that. It's not yet, must belong to it in some way. So Heidegger looks at another example, the moon. What about the moon when it's not full? So when you've got just the crescent moon in the sky, there's part of it there, and then there's the rest outstanding. Is that what death is like? So this not yet together doesn't signify a not yet being together. So it may therefore be more appropriate, because it's still there. It's always there, right? The whole moon, but we're only seeing the crescent, a tiny sliver of it, even though the whole thing is there. So is that how we can understand death? The problem with that is that this not yet pertains only to the way we grasp it perceptually. So Dasein as itself has to become, that is, be what it is not yet. So there's our not yet, Dasein's not yet, isn't already there, but it is contained in the being of Dasein, in our being. And so, whereas the moon, the part that we can't see, is there now. Dasein's not yet isn't present in that way. It's something Dasein has to become. So that's no good. So what about ripening fruit? Is another example. The unripe fruit is the unripeness. So the not yet is already included in its own being. So when unripe fruit becomes ripe, there's that the not yet that was there, the not yet of the ripeness of the fruit is it's in the fruit itself. It doesn't come from somewhere else. It's part of the fruit, but the unripe fruit becomes ripe. So perhaps that's a better analogy. So correspondingly, Dasein too is always already, it's not yet, as long as it is. It's part of our being. So the unwholeness in Dasein is a not yet that every Dasein, as the being that it is, has to be. What our potentiality, what we are becoming, what we are being toward, is something that is part of our being, and it's something that every Dasein has to be. We have to be that. Still, this doesn't square up for Heidegger, because with ripeness, the fruit fulfills itself. It kind of fulfills its destiny. That's not the right word, but it kind of comes to a completeness that was planned or was desired. And but Dasein's death does not necessarily mean fulfillment. So even unfulfilled, Dasein ends. So we obviously, humans can die without achieving any goals or without achieving their particular projects. So that death for Dasein is not like the ripening of fruit, in the sense that the ripening of fruit is a fulfillment of that fruit's potential. It's not going to work for Dasein. So how is death the ending of Dasein? Let's take a slightly different tack. So one option there is that, as Heidegger compares it, to the rain stopping. So when the rain stops, this means that it's no longer objectively present. Right. Another example is a road stopping. When a road stops, what that means is that it has become fully objectively present. So you're driving along the road, there's still road ahead of you, but when it stops, then it's complete. It's become fully objectively present. So that's another way of thinking about ending. And a third way is thinking about what it means for a painting to end. So a painting ends when it's finished, when it's complete, i.e. when the last stroke has been painted. However, none of these appropriately characterize the end of Dasein. Dasein, for the first and the second, the rain stopping and the road, those were both cashed out in terms of something objectively present. Dasein isn't objectively present. And the third example with the painting was it contained that idea of finishing, or kind of drawing something to a close. And that's not what death is for Dasein either. It's not a kind of tying a bow on the whole thing and you know, the end of a complete fulfilled life. That's not Dasein's death either. So the conclusion Heidegger draws is that just as Dasein constantly already is its not yet as long as it is, it also always already is its end. It does not signify a being at an end of Dasein, but rather a being toward the end of this being. So it's a unique way of being that Heidegger's pointing out here. It's probably worth just looking at that and breaking it down a bit. Just as Dasein constantly already is its not yet as long as it is, so Dasein is its potentialities, its possibilities, its projected, the way it projects itself into the future. That's its not yet, and Dasein is that. We've seen that's part of the being of Dasein. It also always already is its end. So in the same way that Dasein is its potentialities, Dasein also is its ending in some way, because that ending is, if you like, a potentiality. It has that same kind of structure. But this does not signify a being at an end of Dasein, because it's not a I am not my end in the sense that I am at the end. I am my end in the sense that it's part of my being in some deeper way, which we're yet to fully flesh out. And the way Heidegger describes it is it's not a being at an end, but a being toward the end of this being, which is to say a being towards death, which we'll come to as we go on. So the next section, the next heading I have is the existential and ontological structure of death. So a couple of definitions to start us off here. Perishing is the ending of what is merely alive. So not Dasein, because Dasein exists. Dasein exists as the there, right? Perishing is the ending of just what is merely alive. And inauthentic death for Dasein, Heidegger calls its demise. And dying, the word dying, is the way of being in which Dasein is towards its death. Okay, cool. So the previous discussion has shown that we can't grasp death as an existential possibility. So not as something that we can, we can't experience it. It's not something we can experience ourselves, but neither can we grasp our relation to our end apart from our relation to our existential possibilities. So we can't grasp it as kind of an ontic, specific event, but we can't grasp it separated from that kind of ontic existence that we have as well. So as such, death must be graspable and manifest indirectly in our relation to all of our possibilities. Since death is a fundamental aspect of our being, it is discernible as a pervasive element and grounded in our fundamental structure of being, care. Okay. Therefore, it must show itself in the fundamental characteristics of the being of Dasein, namely, being ahead of itself, which is existence, already being in, which is facticity, and being together with, which is falling prey. And those three spheres, if you like, make up care, the being of Dasein. So basically all we're saying there is that it's death is something that is tied in with the very core of what Dasein is, of Dasein's being. It's there in everything, and it's graspable in our relation to all of our possibilities, tied in with that fundamental structure of our being, care. So a couple of things that death is, we can outline a couple of insights we can make into death from here. Death is, I've got 4 at this stage. Death is one's ownmost potentiality of being. So since Dasein is concerned about its being in the world absolutely, its death is the possibility of no longer being able to be there. And it's something that only you can face, only you can it's a potentiality only for you. Your death is your potential only. You can't get at it any other way, through anybody else, through anybody else's death, or it's something you have to face kind of as an individual, personally, intimately. It's non-relational, so being immanent to itself, all relations to other Dasein are dissolved in it, in death, that is. So there's no relational character to death. It's the end of relations, if you like. It's insuperable, which is unavoidable. And it's revealed in the attunement of anxiety, the mood of anxiety. Since Dasein's death is not created by itself, it finds itself thrown into this possibility. And if you remember what we talked about earlier in a couple of videos prior about anxiety, anxiety is anxious about not a specific thing in the world, but it's about being in the world in general. And that idea kind of makes clear how appropriate this attunement, this mood, is to death, because death is also about being in the world. It's not about a specific event. It's about our fundamental existence, our being, our care. It's about the core of what Dasein is, who Dasein is. And so anxiety then finally reveals itself as the disclosedness of the fact that Dasein exists as thrown being toward its end. So that's kind of, we bring a deeper understanding to anxiety as well through that. Okay, the next section, being toward death and the everydayness of Dasein. So we've kind of looked at death, being toward death, what it means, but what is it like in the how is it treated in the everyday, the publicness of the they, that everydayness of I guess falling prey that we looked at. So the publicness of everyday being with one another increases the temptation of covering over for itself its own most being toward death. So what does that mean? It's the everydayness of the they avoids death, basically. It's tempting. It gives a temptation to cover over one's being toward death. The fact that death is a part of your being. It's covered over in the public everydayness of the they. So everyday Dasein knows death as a case of death, rather than as something that's personal, something that's intimate and I have to face individually. So idle talk comes in here, and it carries the message that one also dies at the end, but for now one is not affected. Dying is leveled down to an event which does concern Dasein, but which belongs to no one in particular. It's like it's kind of like you understand it intellectually, but it doesn't go any deeper than that. And that's how death is treated or not treated, really, avoided in the entanglement, everyday entanglement. Also, it tranquilizes one about death. So when we comfort someone who's dying by assuring them that they will get better, and that's we never kind of acknowledge that someone is dying. We fight tooth and nail to keep them alive and resist death as long as we can, even when it's clear there's still that idea. If you just keep taking your medicine or whatever, you're going to get better. So there's still that avoidance going on, and the they estranges Dasein from death in governing the way one is supposed to behave towards death in general. So how are we supposed to behave towards death? Well, in the mode of the they, in everydayness, we're not supposed to think about death. And if we do, it's considered a sign of insecurity on the part of Dasein and a gloomy flight from the world. So there's no acceptance. We're not supposed to talk about it. We're not supposed to think about it or mention it. So it increases that temptation for covering over one's own innermost, one's own most being toward death. It tranquilizes one about death, and it estranges Dasein from its death. So those are the three attitudes that the they has about death or inculcates towards death. And what's really interesting is this book, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, is by Tolstoy, has all of those things as those three things I just mentioned. He talks about all of them in this short story, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and I strongly recommend you read it. It's only about, what is it? I think it's about 60 pages, so it's not long, but it's yeah. I mean, I actually didn't know that. I guess Heidegger owes a bit of a debt to Tolstoy for this, because everything I just talked about comes straight out of this book. So it's definitely worth reading that if you're able to get a copy. And it just shows basically Heidegger's philosophy kind of come to life in a novel, or in a short story, or novella, I guess. So anyway, this entangled everyday being toward death is a constant flight from death. Being toward the end has the mode of evading that end. And that's a nice way of putting it too, I think, of Heidegger. He doesn't say Dasein is no longer toward the end. There's no sense in which Dasein is then even in that entangled everyday being of the of the they. It's no longer, sorry, it's not a being toward death. So it's not like a being toward life, is what the idea is. Dasein is always fundamentally being toward death. It's just part of care. It's part of who Dasein is. So Dasein is always being toward death, but it can just if it's kind of avoiding that, if it's trying to cover over that fact, that truth, then it doesn't mean it's not a being toward death anymore. It's still being toward death, just in the mode of evading that end, in the mode of evading that that aspect of Dasein's being, which is cool. Nice way to put it, I think. So the entangled everydayness of Dasein knows about the certainty of death, and yet avoids being certain. The they accomplishes this by saying that death certainly comes, but not right away. With this but, the they denies that death is certain. So it's always postponed to a sometime later. And this covers over a fundamental truth about death, that it is possible in every moment. Another remark that I think is dead on, if you'll excuse the pun. So the existential project of an authentic being toward death. This is kind of a summary of this section. So he begins here by characterizing being toward death as a being toward a possibility, right? But since being toward a possibility is a taking care of that possibility, then this means that we are annihilating the possibility of the possible by making it available. And that means, I should probably clarify that. It sounds confusing. So being toward death is being toward a possibility, but when we think of it in that way, being towards something is in undertaking a project or moving towards a goal. When we do that, we annihilate it as a possibility. It becomes instead something real, something actualized. It becomes an actualized possibility. It loses its status, if you like, as a possibility. However, being toward death is not a possibility that has the kind of being actualized. It's not something we can actualize. It's not a possibility that we can that we can be toward in the same way that we are towards other possibilities that we might have. So the being toward death is a being toward a possibility which can never be actualized. Being toward death is also not meant to be a dwelling near the end, as in a brooding over death. This would be an attempt to exert some kind of control over death. But death must be understood as possibility, cultivated as possibility, and endured as possibility in our relation to it. It never loses that status of possibility. And usually we relate to something possible by expecting it. But again, same problem. Expectation has the character of waiting for an actualization, which won't happen here. So Heidegger calls our being toward death anticipation. And this word anticipation, it's supposed to carry the same connotation as expectation, but with one difference, that what it is we're anticipating will never arrive, will never be actualized. So as possibility, death gives Dasein nothing to be actualized and nothing which it itself could be as something real. It's the possibility of the impossibility of every mode of behavior. Every mode of behavior toward, of every way of existing. So anticipation shows itself as the possibility of understanding one's own most and extreme potentiality of being. That is, as the possibility of authentic existence. And that's kind of what we've been doing here. That's what authenticity, it's kind of what it means for Heidegger, is an authentic existence is one that has this being toward death, is this being toward death, but also one that understands it. And I guess that's the difference between an inauthentic and an authentic existence. There's the latter, the inauthentic. It's still a being toward death. That's what Dasein is, but it covers over that. It levels it down. It avoids it. It's a flight from death. And authenticity involves embracing that aspect of our being. And the final concrete structure of anticipation regarding the ontological structure of death is 5 things. I've got 5 things here which I'll just rattle them off quickly. We've covered 4 of them, I think, already. Death is the ownmost possibility of Dasein. So anticipation tears itself away from the they. Death is non-relational. Anticipation individualizes Dasein to itself. Death is insuperable. So anticipation frees itself for the impossibility of evading death. Frees itself for this being toward death. Death is certain. Anticipation allows the possibility of death to become possible through a disclosedness which is the essence of truth, right? And death is indefinite. Anticipation opens Dasein to the constant threat of death through understanding which is attuned in anxiety. In anxiety, Dasein finds itself faced with the nothingness of the possible impossibility of its existence. And that is being toward death. The last thing I've got here, which I'll just read quickly, as the end of Dasein, death is in the being of this being toward its end. being towards its death. It dies factically and constantly as long as it has not reached its demise. And that's what dying is. Remember, that was our definition a while ago. It's the way of being in which Dasein is towards its death. So Dasein is always dying. We're always being toward death. And I like this, actually. I think it's really it's quite profound, and it's something you don't hear much of. And I think Heidegger's dead right. We do avoid death like the plague. We never talk about it. We never. We're kind of confronted with it all the time, but it never kind of seeps in. It's always it's always something that happens to someone else, right? And so those sometimes though we get those moments where we do realize someone close to us perhaps dies unexpectedly, and then it does get through our defenses, kind of hits home. Yeah, death is anyone could go any time, and but then that feeling usually passes quite quickly, right? Despite the fact that it's a central part of who Dasein is. It's there in every one of our possibilities, in everything that we do. Death is always there. Yeah, cool. So that is authentic being towards death. And next chapter we'll look at resoluteness. So until then, thanks for listening. See ya.